Well, welcome to Athelhampton, and Arthur, thank you so much for putting this amazing exhibition in our new gallery, more than 50 years of your work. But just tell us what got you into painting? How did it begin?
Probably started when I was 7 or 8 and I'd seen a Van Gogh painting and a Bruegel painting, and I thought I want to paint. So I persuaded my father to buy me an oil painting set. There used to be a lovely art shop in Kensington High Street called Reeves, and I went there, I saw this box and they bought it for me. And that started probably at the very beginning of the journey, my attempts to use unguided an oil painting set, which didn't go that well.
But you've done a lot of oil paintings since then, as well as other media?
Yes, probably, apart from the 5 years farming, 5 or 6 years, yes, 50 years of trying to understand this pigment, oil paint and watercolours and gouache and printmaking. They're all interrelated as mediums, they're all very physical mediums. And that's the fascination with it. They're quite grubby, kind of, you get quite dirty using them, and it's quite toxic. So there's all those lovely attractions, which probably, the things that one was preoccupied with as a child. So I've still indulged that kind of play, because I think that is the element that's actually still important. I think Picasso always talked about that play element, very important.
Do you want to talk about perhaps some of your earliest pictures first?
Yes, well, maybe even talk about school, and that was the beginning for me, probably the primary school, when I noticed pictures on the wall. That was probably one of the earliest things. In fact, I've written that in one of my catalogues, being obsessed with a Bruegel and a Van Gogh painting, and it was probably the combination of the two that still feed into most of what I do, really. The Bruegel was, I think, 4 drunk men round a wheel lying on the ground, and I never really understood what the picture meant. It was at the back of the classroom, so I spent a lot of my time with my head craned back, really trying to think, what is this picture about? It was a very dull painted picture, but it was just a mystery, fascinating one. I didn't know what being drunk meant at that age, and it always intrigued me, and that love of a kind of mystery, a hidden narrative, has just been with me all the time, really. And the Van Gogh, there's a portrait of an old man which just was just beautifully painted. It looked so simple. The Van Gogh was a slightly different thing. It had a directness, and I think because it was a picture of an old man that was obviously coming towards the end of his life, and he was in a straw hat, there was just something magical about that. And I think it's that painting probably that made me ask for the oil painting set for Christmas. I think I was 7 or 8, so it was quite a young age to have such a gift. And again, I have told the story. In fact, the MP found that story online, that I struggled with using the paint because I didn't know about priming, and I used the turpentine to make a torch, a flaming torch in my bedroom, and I set fire to the carpet, which I managed to keep hidden probably for 20 years. And my father finally moved out of the house. I'd covered the burn and actually had managed to put it out, which I was always quite proud of, because it was quite a large, sort of 4-foot square bit of carpet that was burning with lots of black bits floating around the room. Anyway, so that was quite a powerful experience, trying to use oil paint for the first time. So that was really the beginning of a career in painting. And I tried to copy the Van Gogh too.
At age 7 or 8, you were copying Van Gogh?
Yeah. Well, it was such a powerful image. I think my father's job, he used to get catalogues from various museums sent to him. And the person they were sent to didn't want them at all, so I got them. So I got quite a lot of really nice catalogues at a very young age. I didn't really know what they were about, a lot of them. But they were quite a quiet influence, having these images about. And they drew me in. So that was really, the beginning. And then I was had to go to a boarding school, which, for reasons I won't go into, but there again I was fortunate enough to meet 2 very good art teachers over I suppose a period of 7 years, and they were both very influential on all the boys, not just me. In fact, the headmaster was desperately trying to get rid of both these art teachers. So.
What he thought art wasn't the thing?
Yeah, he wanted the school to be mathematics. I mean, there was a sixth form of 20, 18 were doing painting. Quite seriously.
Amazing, really.
Yeah. And so most of the boys went off to art college. So again, he made the mistake of employing a very young graduate from Newcastle Polytechnic. It was his first ever job, and the headmaster did not realise this guy was one gay and one quite a modernist. So he got all the boys doing quite interesting work. And he made a mockery of the entire school system, really. He had a slipper which he threatened people, and the slipper was called Veronica. He never used it, but it was more of a joke, really. So, but he was very influential too, very nice. Introduced me to lots of music, that kind of cultural thing, reading as well. So that was when I went off to Camberwell. And so that was along with 4 or 5 other people from my year. So
and you couldn't have really chosen a better place, I would think.
Well, sometimes I look back, it was very I'd become an abstract painter, so I chose Camberwell because I liked the idea of being challenged, and I really was challenged. It's quite harsh. But so that was the beginning of an intense 4 years, really. A lot of work. I did a lot of work. I was trying to paint probably like de Kooning, a sort of abstract expressionist, and failing, not really finishing anything. The painting would, I had one painting just went on for a year, which for a sort of 20-year-old is quite traumatic, really. Not really knowing what you were doing. And I was working at home, in my little flat in Nunhead. And it was, I think it was quite depressing. So I kind of decided I'd start again. Hence Peckham 1, which is a painting in this show, was something I spent probably a year on. And my tutor at the time was a very interesting character, English painter, Ewan Uglow. And he was really good, but he didn't really teach me how to do it. But we were both involved in trying to work out how to make the chair stand on the floor. So it's become quite a poetic. I suppose I was trying to learn how to paint like Vermeer. That was probably in the back of my mind. And I was listening to Beethoven's Ninth and the Four Seasons. So that's very much when I see that painting, particularly the Four Seasons comes back. And living with an Irishman who was an Irish nationalist, who actually introduced me to sort of literature. So I was reading, Hardy, not that there's anything to do with Ireland, but Dostoevsky and all those kind of books, which I'd never voluntarily read a book up until that point. So I read the Brothers Karamazov, which is, I think, nearly 1,000 pages.
Is there some influence of them in those pictures?
Yeah, I think very much all that literature. And also the A-level literature, the sort of people like who wrote Mr. Weston's Good Wine, Theodore Paris. They're kind of eccentric, sort of kind of visionaries, I suppose. And again, they're in that strange, magical, poetic world And I think that's always intrigued me. You know, in fact, the Peckham 1 painting is quite a depressed painting. I was probably, you know, pretty down as an individual at the time, but most people see that, you know, as quite luminous and, you know, positive painting.
But the Peckham 2, which you got next to that in this exhibition, was that done more or less the same time?
It was done the same, and that was kind of a visual joke on Goya's clothed and unclothed. So
Yep. Yes.
I put a drape over it, and the trunk is actually a school trunk, so that's again a reference back to school days. And the plant is a Fatsia japonica, which I believe is quite poisonous if you eat it.
Right.
And the chair was, well, in the Japanese prints I'd found in the dustbin, which are the pictures on the wall. So I rescued those, and the chair was just from a friend's, and I'd painted it green because I wanted to learn about green. So that's really what that painting kind of is about, except that Ewan and I both struggled with trying to work out why there's this kind of optical illusion in it. It kind of doesn't make sense. The two lines of the floor look as though they don't meet, but if you actually draw it out, they do meet. So Ewan came round and we both sat trying to work out how that has happened and why.
And that's so interesting because I'd been looking at that and thinking exactly that they don't seem to meet, and I thought, surely this must be intentional. Yeah,
I do quite like that kind of optical illusion that they'd slide apart the two floor planes behind. So again, you've got a painting of a trunk, and it is just a painting. So I could have it not meeting. Also, people like Cézanne had tabletops that didn't meet and moved it up for pictorial reasons. I should have probably made it look right as opposed to having it drawn correctly.
No, I think it's great to make it.
Yeah.
No,
well, quite a lot of story came out of it because then Ewan painted, or whether he was painting at the time, nude from 12 parallel viewpoints. I can't remember the name of the painting, but he painted a nude. So he was on eye level to each part of the body. So it ended up being an 8-foot figure because of the necessary distortion. But what he then realised what I'd done was painted two picture planes, one directly in front of me and one looking down. And it's all getting a bit sort of technical, but it's just quite an interesting, quite intense time. So, yeah.
And where did you move on to after that in terms
Well,
of
that
painting?
was the question. I did fall in love with somebody that was highly unsuitable, so I went off and became a farm worker. My postgraduate was actually working on a sheep farm, to begin with in Wales, which was an amazing place. That was just for board and lodging, and 10 number 6 cigarettes a day. And that was a lovely family sheep farm. It was glorious, just outside of Krakow. So the sheep gathered on the hilltop there, 20,000 were gathered from all the different farms and then brought down as a group. So I didn't do any work there, but I was storing up kind of imagery. And again, I was living the hardy life, sort of. I didn't drive any sheep off a cliff, but it was all kind of there, really, I think. Yeah, so anyway, I've graduated. I learnt to milk cows and do all sorts of other stuff. The idea being that I would learn enough to be able to just, do that for maybe 3 months and work painting the rest of the year. But of course, that's not how it worked out. It was so badly paid that I ended up doing it full time.
And the engravings that we got in the exhibition here, was they just after that?
No, the first batch, I did the illustrations of Edward Thomas at the beginning. And that was quite interesting because I did it at college because I was supposed to do a subsidiary subject, which I'd completely refused to do until the last year, and I was told I wouldn't get my Dip AD unless I did some etching. So I went to the printmaking department and met the technician who just said, "Where the bloody hell have you been for the last 2 years?" And he was really quite aggressive and scary.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but I started doing it and he realised I was doing it quite seriously. And I mentioned, I thought I would illustrate, but I'd like to do some illustrations for Edward Thomas. And he introduced me to Eric Ayers, who was the typographer at Camberwell, who'd just done Hockney's Grim Fairy Tales. He'd done the typography for that. So and he didn't have any students, so he was really pleased to find me. Then I was introduced then to a bookbinder and a paper manufacturer, dealer. So the whole lot came together under this technician who, just because I was enthusiastic, he used to give up his Saturdays, come in, help. So that triggered that first one, but that was done within college. Then I had Edward Thomas's centenary exhibition was coming up, so a book dealer got in touch with me and asked if I would do another book celebrating that. And I said yes, and in exchange for a small printing press, I started doing those prints for the second book of Edward Thomas.
Yes, yes.
And
that's the railway
Athelhampton.
Yeah.
That was in the first book.
Yeah.
The second book was less actually. The first book was a very major undertaking. It was all leather bound and very complicated structure. So I only did 8 copies.
Yeah.
But the second book was 75 copies, and so it's a small edition, but we had quite a good English writer write a foreword.
Lovely, yeah.
And I went and met the poet's daughter as well, which was she was quite cross with me with the first book.
Oh, really? What, because you just don't...
Well, she misunderstood the fact that the intention was actually to combine my life with the life of the poet. So I was not trying to be Edward Thomas. I was doing things that happened to me as basis for the illustrations. So I put a water butt in the picture, and the line was, "Only the elm butt tops the nettles now." And she pointed out that I was rather ignorant, and that an elm butt is a tree stump.
Of course. Oh dear.
So she got, actually she was quite, but by the time I spent a couple of hours with her, she realised my love of his poetry was quite serious.
Yeah.
And then we offered her a copy of the book, so then she was really chuffed over the moon, loved it, so yeah. But it was strange meeting the daughter who he had written about. So yeah, that was quite strange. It wasn't a particularly complimentary poem.
And the Hardy, the sheep dip, for example, was
well,
that
because I was working on farms, I was reading, well, I'd read all the novels and the poems, and there was one particular poem that I came across because I had a border collie, and it's where a farmer throws a stick into the harbour or whatever it is, because he can't afford to feed the dog. So the dog drowns, and it's the last look the dog gives the guy, and that somehow stuck with me as an image, as a very powerful, very different to sort of Edward Thomas. So I started reading a lot of poetry as well. So that was, the introduction. I did have a plan to illustrate it, but in the end I did a couple of paintings. There's a painting in the room with the sewing machine that is also Hardy-esque. But it's there in all of the images, really, the sort of love of the countryside and also the meaning of the countryside and farming folk too, I think in particular. The rural life is kind of quite brutal. I quite like that side of it. And in Hardy, that is there. And also the human shows, as I mentioned before, Time's laughing stocks. I just love those words that evoke in some sense of what I like in a painting. I don't like narrative painting as such, but I like there to be some kind of meaning for me, even if it's not obvious.
And I mean, just leaping ahead in the years, we can come back. You mentioned that some of your much more recent work has got some of that human shows, that...
Yeah, very definitely. I think a painter I've always liked, everyone thinks I'm trying to paint like Diebenkorn or Ewan or so on, but the painter I probably affected me in a different way to any of the other things. It was Beckmann, Max Beckmann, a German expressionist. Again, those paintings, are very hard to fathom. Although I might actually get more of an inkling now because I'm beginning to read about mysticism, which I think he was quite involved with. But yeah, his poems, there was one particular poem I again saw on a catalogue, Carnival by Max Beckmann, which is a very shallow space with 2 people, lovers, possibly a couple in it, and you have no idea. He's a monkey at the bottom. Beckmann portrays himself as a masked monkey. It's a very dark painting, and I still go and see it. It's usually in Tate Britain. And I just love it because it's still, I don't know what it's about. And I love the fact that it's endlessly open to my evolution as an individual. It means a great deal now. It meant a great deal to me a long time ago, but the meaning is probably very different.
Which is true of some of the pictures of yours here, how you can interpret them in.
Yeah, I quite like that kind of ambiguity. The more you nail it down, the more I think there's less room, like we were talking in the car, for imagination to take root in the picture. It's like all that kind of imagery. The Vanitas one, which is the one with the sewing machine, which again I like. I've always liked the Vanitas idea. You know, the skull and a reminder of death. And actually, I hadn't realised the sewing machine is quite a good thing to have in the, because it stands for production, human achievement. And yeah, so it contrasts that with jugs, which are vessels, you know, emptied. You can have a jug on its side or a candle on its side, which is death. But the skull actually belonged to Jane's brother.
Oh, really?
Yes, so it is a real skull. It's not a plastic one, which I had on loan for a while.
Oh.
But I think Jane was quite keen to give it back.
Yes.
It's not the kind of mantelpiece ornament. You are very aware when you've got a human skull and you're staring at it for 3 weeks, what that kind of signifies, really.
Yeah, well, you know, the sewing machine there is my mum's old sewing machine. So
yeah.
There's an element
There's
of
a
memory
connection
there.
Yeah, I think that painting belongs in there, really.
Yeah. Arthur, these Peckham pictures are some of the earliest ones you did. Just tell us a bit about them.
Yeah, they're my obsession with trying to work out how to paint, really is what they're about. So I had this very simple subject: a school trunk, a chair, a fancy japonica and some prints in a corner of the room. So it was really, I spent probably a year working on these, just trying to work out what a painting of mine might look like. I'm not entirely sure they're ever finished properly, but that's what I put in my degree show. This painting, these two paintings, and the bandstand painting. They're kind of a nod to all sorts of things, really. Surrealism, just trying to work out colour, how to paint space, how to paint an object. So that's all that's to them, except for the links to literature, music, the books I was reading, to the Goya, the clothed, the unclothed. So they're kind of little poetic reference that probably come out through boredom modern, actually. When you're painting a thing for that long, your mind kind of wanders down what the paintings could mean, whether they have any meaning. You know, what is a painting, really? I suppose I was also looking at Vermeer and sort of kind of failing because I didn't have any suitable models to stand sort of reading a letter or something like that. So I had to make do with a simple plant. This bandstand painting, again, is one that was done at a similar sort of time to the Peckham paintings, a little bit later. And again, it's a kind of nod, strangely, to Rothko. I was getting quite interested in banding and colours that slightly move one against another. So it's a very structured painting about muted greens and greys, but also the fact that I went on to actually work in Green Park, emptying the bins. So this is actually Kensington Gardens bandstand, and my mother used to sunbathe there when I was probably 6 or 7 before she left and ran off with a dustman.
But if you kind of blank out the grandstand, it is a bit like a Roscoe, isn't it?
Yeah, very much. And that's also echoed in the cornfield painting. Again, the banding, one layer against another. I just love that kind of close tone, close colour thing. You know, these shifts across here, the echo of that. And also how soft. You know, rather than painting every twig, I was trying to think of how to resolve it in terms of the whole painting, as opposed to all the parts, really.
Should we look at the cornfield painting?
Yeah. Right. So this seems like a logical following of the bandstand, but in fact, that was between the bandstand and this painting was probably about 5 years where I didn't really do any work apart from the odd etching. So this was when I actually started to try and learn to paint again after 5 years working on a farm and I thought I'd be able to work out how to paint by thinking about it, But then I realised as soon as I started painting, thinking about it was absolutely no use whatsoever. So I kind of started again. So, but this did remind me of the bandstand painting because of the banding and the fact this, you know, if you focus on it, it actually almost goes out of focus and the birds kind of hover. Never quite sure what birds they are. I thought of them as skylarks, but I don't think skylarks do that. It's probably sparrows. But yeah, so specifically, I'm not sure. But it was a barley field, so it's blowing in the wind. And over here, which you can't see now, it was, I think, in fact, they demolished it, was the colliery, Betshanger Colliery. So, yeah. And it's a painting I've always liked because of this banding and this structure. It's a very simple painting on one level, but getting the colours to sort of work together.
Arthur, just tell us about some of the engravings here.
Well, they sort of fall into two groups, really. The ones I did when I had to do printmaking at Camberwell. So this is kind of this main group here, which were all part of the first book, 50 Faggots. This one's actually a Thomas Hardy one. That's Adlestrop from the first book, and Up in the Wind, which is a lovely story in itself. I would recommend reading that. And that one where the lady from here runs off to Kennington to live and find a life there. Again, Hardy-esque. I think there's a big overlap between that kind of poetry and Thomas Hardy's poetry. And then in the second book, which is mainly these images, well, actually, not the sheep, but that was done when I was working on the farm. It's about the only thing I managed to do during my time working at Ware Park Farm. The sheep all lambed inside, and this ewe, lovely ewe, was, I think she was called White Ewe the Third. Anyway, she had a lamb and it started suckling, but then there was another one on the way, so I had to abandon my drawing of her, because this was drawn direct onto a copper plate, and go and get a bucket and help deliver. So that was the only real effort, apart from this lady who, yeah, that was a stream that ran through the farm in Ware, strangely enough, which was a great place to live. Mainly because people say, where do you live? I live in Ware. Ware.
Nice. And Arthur, there's a copy of your book actually there, isn't there?
Yes. I don't know whether I could, we'll maybe look at that later.
Yeah, no, I think
I could
just
hold
pick
it
it
up.
up. They're lovely, yeah. Let's have a look. There we are.
That's the poem Thor. This was quite a limited edition of 75 copies. See if I find, turning the pages, I should put something in. That one's a lovely poem. I won't read it now, but...
Cut. Arthur, tell us about these marvellous portraits. I think they were both in the National Portrait Gallery.
Yes, they were exhibited probably in the very early 80s. This is a portrait of my wife with me reflected in the window, and it's quite a sad painting. I won't go into the details, but yes, it was about a difficult moment for all of us, really. So that is the kind of mood of that painting. This one, not quite so gloomy, is actually after the birth of our child, and there's a portrait of my wife and myself and the baby in front of a very good friend called Daniel Backhouse, and that won a prize in the Portrait Award. I think it was the John Player Portrait Award thing, which you're probably not supposed to say. But yeah, I was quite pleased with both of these paintings. But again, fundamentally, they're about trying to work out how I would make a painting. So my wife probably sat for 100 hours for that painting. Wow. Actually, as I was sort of deciding where to put her. And likewise, this guy, I actually paid him to sit. But it enabled him to get through college, which was also quite good for both of us. And he became a very good family friend as well. And his girlfriend said again, which is probably something that could be edited, is that she said about it, I can hear him picking his fingers in that painting, which obviously used to annoy her quite a lot. So yeah, these were two quite important paintings for me. They were my first serious attempt after farming to try and get sort of going, get some sort of momentum. And so, yes, after the 5 years or 6 years farming, this was my first real attempt. And I was married as well, so trying to earn about the same as I was earning as a farm worker. And that's where it ties in with the prints as well, and also the portrait of Peter Garman, which we haven't touched on, but we can mention that in relation to the large Deal painting.
I mean, these are a pretty dramatic change from what went before, aren't they, really?
Yeah, I see it as a kind of evolution. I mean, I think they link quite well to the Peckham.
Yes.
I was kind of picking up the thread of where that stopped. And I'd like to paint people more, but it's always a tricky proposition, really, painting people. But so these were just trying to move it on. So there's an evolution. This is much thicker handling paint. A lot of paint was scraped off on this one. So they are about the way my work was just going generally. And they kind of also relate to the garden paintings that I was doing sort of after this, I would imagine.
Arthur, Deal, a gay town. That's your hometown. Wonderful picture, amazing. The dynamism in it and colours. And
Yeah, it was quite a departure for me. This is again an attempt to really understand how to make a painting. So it is based on a sort of sensation of Deal seafront in a summer. I think it was, I always forget when the Falklands were, but I think
82.
81, 82. So I may have started it then, and the Union Jack was, I don't know whether it was quite ironic putting that in, but it's also to do with the character in this painting is the Peter Garman in the painting around the corner, which was another Portrait Award picture. So yes, it was really just understanding colour. I was doing quite grey paintings, and this was just an attempt to use purer colour. And it's a preoccupation that carries on to this day, really, just trying to work out how to find a function for colour in a painting rather than just it being an illustration or a kind of realism. So yes, that's what really is. And just the beach life in Deal. I mean, I love the little tiny vignettes of these people on the beach, the application of suntan oil, people doing somersaults, and the fact that Deal was, for a long time, a gay town. It's got a bit of a revival, but it was the favourite haunt of lots of actors and writers. People like Charles Hawtrey had houses, Desmond Carrington. So Deal was a very lively town with slight hints of corruption or whatever the word is.
Dear,
What's
right,
the word? Right. And it was also a place where the Marine School of Music was based, and the last of the British mines were at Bettshanger. So yes, the Marines and the miners used to enjoy meeting to fight, basically. And the gays quite like the Marines. Sort of.
He says, moving on quickly. Tell us about that red dot, because I think that at the top that can be interpreted in different ways.
Yeah, well, it's again, when I was farming, I was working with the sheep one day in the water meadows, and a large balloon appeared in the landscape, and the sheep were absolutely horrified. They couldn't understand, and it was a balloon that had blown off course with the band members of Thin Lizzy in it, which is a band from probably that era. Anyway, then I just quite like balloons as images. There's a very well-known, well, I suppose he's not that well-known, British painter, Michael Andrews, who used the balloon as a metaphor for life. So he did a series of balloons in the city called The Ship in Gulf. So I just like the idea of a balloon appearing, standing for something. So yeah, that's really what the balloon signifies.
Arthur, we're coming right up to date now, because you're still very much painting these pictures, 2-3 years ago, really?
Yeah, they start from a little longer ago. Swan Vesta, which is the one with the homage to Swan Vesta matchbox, which I just like as an image, the red, green Swan Vesta. Sounds like a sort of heroine from a Bond movie. That's nothing really, it just came into my mind weirdly at that moment. But it's still exploring colour, how to use colour as light. And so it's a development of the same, it's an extension of the trunk in a way, finding a small corner of quite banal objects and trying to make a painting out of them. Again, it's quite Matisse influence probably. He's always in the back of my mind. And the same with this one, with a step ladder, is again a sort of, it happened to be there because I was getting some moulding down from the top of the studio, and it was there, and I thought actually I quite like that as a big structure in this painting. So I started painting. I thought, well, I quite like this. I quite like the squareness of the painting, this diagonal the simple cheap chair, and these kind of objects. There's actually a broken frying pan, broken Stilsons, some abandoned coffee pots. But again, I like these sort of simple objects, and it's just, predominantly a vehicle for colour to work, to see if colour can work together. And these sort of more recent ones, this is probably the most recent. These three are all relatively recent. This painting I'm particularly fond of because it kind of just worked. And I think that's the magic of painting. What one aims for is that moment when a thing comes together and there's no planning to it. It's just, oh, I quite like that. Or you leave it. I think I described before what I call the patio test. From the studio to my patio, I carry a painting. I have to put it down to open the door, and quite often I look at it as it's on the patio floor, think no, and then it goes back to the studio. Sometimes it gets in the house, which is a new stage, then it goes on one wall. Sometimes my wife notices it and says, oh, that's a new painting. What is that? So that's how the process works, is whether something's finished or not. But occasionally, very occasionally, I just bring one in straight away and it goes on the wall. And it has its own completeness. Then you come down the next day and hope that you still feel the same about it. Often one doesn't. It's the nature of painting.
I mean, this painting, I find this, really a wonderful painting. Actually, the colours are fabulous, but the kind of dynamics between the two characters there could be a bit remote, could be sort of happy in themselves.
Well, that's where it comes back to the Hardy issue, which is kind of in both of these paintings, sort of relationships between people. And again, I don't like the idea of actually I'm going to illustrate this particular storyline. I like the story to evolve almost by accident. Suddenly there's two figures in a relationship. I might work on one and that figure fails. Then this one came out by accident. So it was originally part of a seascape. So is she inside, outside? It could be a painting. But in the end, for me, it's really about this juxtaposition of these colours, that feed each other. And again, with this one, I don't really know what that's about, but the character on the left, if he is a person, looks quite old, and the one on the right looks quite young, but they could be a couple. I don't really know what's going on, but it just happened one day, and I thought, well, there's a lot I don't like about it that I feel is unsatisfactory, but I don't want to lose what I like about it, because then you just have years of regret and thinking, why didn't I? And I do have thousands of photographs of painting stages, and quite often you think, well, maybe I should have left it. So this one, I kind of risk leaving it. And basically, the pink comes from Katie's dress, which I painted, this model who sat for me. I got rather obsessed with this pink, so pink started appearing in a lot of painting. Pink and grey, pink and blue, pink. So that became a kind of a formal exercise that I quite often work on. This is extension of the pinks, the light pink, the dark pink against the blue. Again, it evokes sunlight. It's kind of a figure. She's sort of incomplete, but again, I would, quite like. That's another one that came in, and I thought, I'll leave that. Doesn't matter what Jane says. Yes. So that probably covers most of that. But yeah, going back to the Hardy, it is those words: times, laughing stocks, human shows. I think that is the buried narrative, as I think that I like to be there. It's not what the paintings are ultimately about, but I like that kind of element to exist in a painting, because it's more sustaining as an image then. It's not just a picture, there's something else there, something of my history, and then it often responds, connects to the history of the person looking at it, the imagination of the person looking at it. So I do quite like that.
We were chatting earlier about poetry and the relations to the paintings and Thomas Hardy, and I think, as you know, we've been doing some work here on Thomas Hardy, filming some of his poems, and I think there is always that thing about the ambiguity in the poems, and I think you've reflected some of that in the ambiguity in your pictures.
Particularly, the one that I illustrated that's in this show, the Thomas Hardy poem, Sheep Fair, It's very much about that. It's quite a banal, description of a sheep fair, but actually it has all of life in that story. And for me, again, I had a very strong connection to that, the teeming rain, the sheep, and the fact then the auctioneer. And I've been to many a sheep auction where they're shouting out the price of the animals, and you see these endless stream of animals. And it's quite powerful, quite upsetting when you see these animals treated in that way. But the kind of irony is that all the auctioneers go the same way. So it's a kind of full circle. And that is in that poem very much so.
Arthur, more of your very recent pieces here.
Yes, this is another extension of the human shows idea, which is where I put groups of figures together so they create a kind of dynamic. Again, it's not really fundamentally what the picture's about. It's really about colour, finding how this sings against these colour relationships. So it's finding a kind of balance of that. But I also like here, there's two figures. We don't actually know what's going on, and there's a third one, possibly outside, possibly listening. I don't know. I just quite like that ambiguous little story. It's quite entertaining. So it works for me on one level of just being paint. There's a theory of painting that it's just about colours arranged in a certain order over a surface that either means something or it doesn't, which I quite like. I think it was said in the late 1800s. I can't remember who said it, but I think it's a very good way of describing a painting, really, which comes on to this, probably the most recent little painting, which is an extension of the studio and garden paintings, which have, grew out of these ultimately. So this was just a little square. I like the square format, and it's just putting these colours together, these brush strokes, kind of little brush strokes, stripes, red, green, little blues. So to me, it's becoming hints of, it sounds arrogant, but what I like about Howard Hodgkin are these kind of dense rectangles, and that is the beginning of that kind of thing, which I'm hoping to sort of develop, like in the other painting around the corner of the two figures, one inside, one outside. So kind of, still a little bit of narrative going on, but really about colour. And this one, which actually preceded that, which is an extension of Peckham 1, coming back to a single chair. Again, the Van Gogh chair was probably quite a big influence on me. I painted a lot of chairs when I was at art college, but really painting a chair is one of the hardest things to do. So if you want to work from the model, trying to get a chair to stand on the floor, if you draw it kind of accurately, it doesn't necessarily look like it's on the floor. So quite often I quite like that preoccupation. But here again, the colour has moved on from Peckham. The colour's much stronger, richer. The structures, I'm still looking for the perfect placement for things on a rectangle. So really that's what, again, the formal aspect of the painting. And also the banal kind of objects, the reference to a child's toy horse, which was actually decomposing because it is 40 years old, and the dying geranium. So I quite like, decaying things, things covered in dust. But it was also a nod back to the pink dress, which again, is just trying to solve different pinks. So really that's what that painting's about, objects in an empty room. And then again, it reflects back to the vanitas idea of the sewing machine and the skull and those kind of images in paintings. So,
Arthur, we've come pretty well up to date in terms of your work. Just tell us a little bit about where you're going in the future, perhaps.
Well, the best thing about being a painter, or what sort of painter I am, it's never a kind of additive thing. It's not, I'll do this, then this will happen. It's going to the studio, sometimes working very late at night, and something happens. And it's, for years, I think when I was at art college, the anxiety of that state, I can't remember who calls it, it's the creative anxiety is actually a recognised place to be. There's kind of a mixture of fear of the unknown and all those kind of things. So, I don't know what's happening next. It is probably a development of maybe areas, say, even in this painting, of these colour combinations that become more significant in their own right as, vehicles for evocation. That sounds a bit wordy, but that's kind of what I mean. Going back to the poetry thing, poetry is an evocation of something. There's a lovely painting, a drawing by Matisse. It's a time when I was trying to paint hyacinths, which is one of my favourite flowers because of the scent and the shape of the little florets. And the more I tried to make it sort of realistic, the deader the painting looked. So ultimately I turned to this Matisse book, and there was this tiny drawing of a single floret, and it was like a hand, and it's trying to draw the gesture of the flower as opposed to drawing the flower. And it's, again, that comes back to the drawings of Katie. It's trying to draw the gesture of a figure, because the more you make it lifelike, the more, sort of absurd it seems to become, or the less right it is. So yeah, that is probably where I'm going next, trying to solve the same problem. But that's quite a luxury place to be, really.
Arthur, thank you so much for coming here, for showing your amazing work at Athelhampton. We appreciate very much. And thank you for doing the video. I hope people have enjoyed it.
Well, thank you too for being so supportive over many years. So thank you, Giles, and thank you to Athelhampton.